The Roman Empire stood as the ultimate symbol of wealth, power, and control in the ancient world. At its height, Rome seemed less like a kingdom and more like the very center of human civilization itself. Stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the rolling hills of Spain, from the rugged frontiers of Britain all the way to the rivers of Mesopotamia, it was the largest and most influential empire the West had ever known. Its legions marched virtually unchallenged across continents. Its administrative system created a framework so advanced that pieces of it would echo into modern governments. Rome built aqueducts that carried water for miles, roads that connected cities like arteries in a vast body, and monumental architecture designed to awe anyone who entered its walls. To many, it looked like an empire destined to last forever. And yet, if you stand in the ruins of the Roman Forum today, surrounded by crumbling stone columns and broken statues, you're staring at the remnants of a fallen giant. The empire that once ruled millions collapsed, piece by piece, until its western half was extinguished in the year 476 CE. Why did this happen? Was it because of invaders storming the gates? Was it because of corruption from within? Or was it something more subtle, a slow unraveling of the very fabric that once held Rome together? The truth is not simple. The Roman Empire didn't collapse overnight. Its fall was the result of centuries of internal weakness, external pressure, and financial strain. To understand how it crumbled, we have to understand first how it became so wealthy and why that wealth eventually poisoned the empire from within. Rome's story begins not as an empire, but as a republic, a city-state with ambitions far greater than its borders. And in that ambition lay both the seeds of its greatness and the seeds of its destruction. From republic to empire. Long before Rome became an empire, it was a republic, a system designed to avoid kingship after the Romans overthrew their monarch in 509 BCE. This republic thrived on a delicate balance between elected officials, the Senate, and the voice of the people, at least in theory. In practice, Rome's politics were riddled with corruption, backroom deals, and bitter rivalries between powerful elites. Despite these flaws, however, Rome's republic had one undeniable strength. It knew how to conquer. Starting with wars against neighboring Italian tribes, Rome slowly built up its military machine. Then came the Punic Wars against Carthage, a wealthy trading power in North Africa. After decades of brutal fighting, including the legendary campaign of Hannibal crossing the Alps, Rome emerged victorious. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome controlled not just Italy, but Spain, North Africa, Greece, and parts of Asia Minor. With each victory came spoils. Enormous sums of wealth poured into Rome: gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, slaves from conquered lands, and taxes from newly subjugated provinces. Senators and generals became unimaginably rich. Luxurious villas sprouted across the Italian countryside. The city of Rome itself swelled with marble temples, theaters, and marketplaces funded by war booty. But this sudden flood of wealth carried hidden costs. Ordinary farmers, once the backbone of the republic, couldn't compete with the massive estates worked by slaves captured in war. Many abandoned their land, flocking to the overcrowded city of Rome where unemployment soared. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. At the same time, ambitious generals realized they could use their armies not just to defend Rome, but to seize political power for themselves. Soldiers were loyal not to the Senate, but to the commanders who promised them land, pay, and loot. Rome had become a state where the sword increasingly dictated politics. No one embodied this new era more than Julius Caesar, a brilliant general, a cunning politician, and a man who understood how to win popular support. Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, an act of defiance that made civil war inevitable. When the dust settled, he emerged as Rome's most powerful man. The Senate tried to cling to tradition, but Caesar was declared dictator for life. His assassination in 44 BCE was supposed to restore the Republic. Instead, it shattered it. The civil wars that followed brought Caesar's heir, Octavian, to power. Renamed Augustus, he became Rome's first emperor. Under Augustus, Rome entered an age of order and prosperity. The empire expanded, its borders secured by legions stationed from Britain to Judea. Augustus reformed taxation, stabilized the currency, and launched massive building projects. The Senate still existed, but it was clear that ultimate power now rested in the hands of one man. The Republic was dead. The empire had been born. Rome's conquests meant unimaginable wealth, but this wealth came at a cost. The empire relied on constant expansion to feed its treasury. Provinces paid taxes, but they also needed protection and infrastructure. As Rome grew, so did the strain of administering it. Augustus's system of provincial governors worked well for a while, but the empire's sheer size meant corruption was inevitable. For nearly 2 centuries after Augustus, Rome enjoyed what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade flourished, roads and aqueducts spread civilization. Cities across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East prospered. To the outside world, it looked like an unshakable golden age.
But beneath that golden surface, fractures were spreading. Wealth inequality continued to deepen. Political power became increasingly centralized, and as emperors came and went, the very stability of Rome depended less on laws and institutions, and more on the whims of whoever wore the crown. Rome had become the richest empire the world had ever seen, but it had also built a system that would one day struggle to sustain itself without endless conquest, flawless leadership, and a treasury overflowing with gold. And history shows us that no empire, no matter how powerful, can count on having all three forever. The Golden Age and cracks beneath the surface. For much of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Roman Empire looked invincible. This was the age of emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, leaders remembered for expanding borders, strengthening administration, and presiding over cultural flourishing. Trade routes stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Exotic spices from India, silks from China, and grain from Egypt poured into Roman markets. The city of Rome itself was a spectacle, filled with marble temples, bustling forums, and amphitheaters that could seat tens of thousands. This period is often called the high point of the Pax Romana, 2 centuries where the empire enjoyed relative stability. But as dazzling as Rome looked at its height, trouble was always lurking beneath the surface. One issue was religion. Romans traditionally worshipped a pantheon of gods, modeled closely after the Greek system. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and countless others were honored with elaborate rituals and festivals. Religion was less about personal faith and more about civic duty. It was part of what it meant to be Roman. But the arrival of new beliefs unsettled this system. Among them was Christianity, which grew out of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century. At first, Christians were a small, persecuted minority. Roman officials often viewed them as dangerous because they refused to worship the emperor or the traditional gods, undermining what they saw as essential to Roman unity. Brutal crackdowns followed, though many of the more dramatic stories, like Christians being routinely fed to lions, were exaggerated later. Still, the tension between the state and new religions added a simmering instability that never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, leadership was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Rome's emperors were absolute rulers, and their personalities shaped the destiny of millions. A competent leader could bring prosperity. A reckless one could plunge the empire into chaos. The danger of this system became clear with the rise of Commodus in 180 CE. The teenage son of Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire at its height, but quickly became infamous for erratic behavior. Instead of focusing on governance, he spent time in the gladiator arena, styling himself as a living god and wasting resources on self-indulgence. His assassination in 192 CE unleashed a period of turmoil known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Rival claimants rose and fell in quick succession, bribing the Praetorian Guard, assassinating rivals, and plunging the empire into civil war. The Roman world survived this crisis, but it never truly recovered its former sense of stability. From this point on, emperors came and went at a dizzying pace. Some ruled for only a few months before being murdered or overthrown. The army often acted as kingmaker, declaring generals as emperors in exchange for bribes. The very institution that had once guaranteed Rome's security became one of its greatest sources of instability. At the same time, the empire's vast wealth began to strain its own system. Maintaining the legions, building massive public works, and supplying Rome's grain-hungry population required staggering amounts of money. Taxes climbed higher and higher. Corruption flourished in the provinces as governors skimmed wealth for themselves. And the gap between the glittering elite and the struggling poor widened into a chasm. For the average citizen, life in Rome wasn't golden marble and flowing fountains. It was cramped housing, unemployment, and dependence on state handouts of bread and entertainment, the famous bread and circuses policy. The Roman state had to keep its population fed and entertained, or risk unrest. But every loaf of bread, every amphitheater game cost money the treasury struggled to find. Rome still looked invincible, but the cracks were widening. Religion, corruption, inequality, and reckless emperors were slowly weakening the foundations of the empire. And the moment Rome appeared vulnerable, its enemies at the borders would be ready to strike. The 3rd century crisis and the struggle to rebuild. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire had grown so vast that managing it became almost impossible. Communication between distant provinces could take weeks. Local governors often acted like kings in their own right, while the emperor in Rome struggled to keep any real control. The cracks that had been forming for decades finally split wide open. The trouble began with a cycle of unstable leadership. Between the years 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors came and went, many reigning only months before being assassinated or overthrown. Historians call this chaotic period the crisis of the 3rd century. For Roman citizens, it felt less like a mighty empire and more like a state tearing itself apart from within. Civil wars broke out as generals declared themselves emperor, each backed by their own loyal legions. The once disciplined army had turned into a political weapon. Soldiers expected bribes and rewards for their loyalty, and if they didn't get them, they simply switched allegiance to a rival claimant. The emperor's throne became the most dangerous seat in the world.
While Rome fought itself, external enemies seized the chance to strike. Germanic tribes pressed into the empire from the north, raiding Roman towns and farmland. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, powerful and organized, launched invasions that claimed large chunks of Roman territory. At the same time, the empire faced revolts within its provinces. 2 major breakaway states emerged. In the west, the Gallic Empire declared independence, ruling over Gaul, Spain, and Britain. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire, led by the ambitious Queen Zenobia, seized control of Egypt and much of the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, the once mighty Roman Empire was fractured into three competing states. The economy collapsed under the strain. Endless wars and political instability drained the treasury. To fund the military, emperors minted more coins with less silver, causing rampant inflation. Prices soared, trade declined, and ordinary citizens struggled to survive. The empire that had once dazzled the world with wealth now teetered on the brink of ruin. And yet, Rome did not die in the 3rd century. Against the odds, a series of strong rulers managed to pull it back from the edge. One of the most important was Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 CE. A brilliant general, Aurelian crushed both the Gallic and Pomeranian empires, reuniting the fractured Roman world. He also fortified the city of Rome itself with massive defensive walls, acknowledging for the first time that the eternal city was no longer untouchable. Though his reign was short, Aurelian restored enough stability for Rome to survive. A few decades later, Diocletian took the throne and made even bolder reforms. Recognizing that no single man could rule such a vast territory, he divided the empire into East and West, each ruled by its own emperor and co-emperor in a system called the Tetrarchy. He reorganized the provinces, strengthened the army, and stabilized the economy with new taxation systems. For the first time in generations, Rome looked governable again. But Diocletian also revealed a truth that Rome could no longer deny. The empire had grown too large, too complex, and too vulnerable to be ruled as a single centralized state. His reforms gave Rome breathing room, but they also acknowledged the empire's deep fragility. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome had survived its darkest hour. But survival came at a cost. The empire was no longer the same confident power of Augustus and Trajan's days. It had become a battered giant, scarred by civil war, humbled by enemies, and increasingly dependent on heavy taxation and military strength to hold itself together. Rome had been saved, for now, but the seeds of decline had sunk even deeper into its foundation. Constantine, Christianity, and the shift of power. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, his carefully balanced system of the Tetrarchy quickly unraveled. The empire once again fell into civil wars as rival claimants fought for the throne. Out of this chaos emerged one of Rome's most famous rulers, Constantine the Great. Constantine was a shrewd general and politician, but what set him apart wasn't just his military victories. It was the way he reshaped Rome's culture, religion, and very identity. In 312 CE, on the eve of a decisive battle for control of the empire, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and, against the odds, he won. From then on, Constantine embraced Christianity. This was revolutionary. For centuries, Christians had been marginalized, sometimes persecuted, often dismissed as a fringe sect. Now the most powerful man in the empire openly favored their faith. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, granting religious tolerance across the empire. Over time, Constantine poured resources into building churches, supporting bishops, and strengthening the influence of this once persecuted religion. By making Christianity central to the empire's identity, Constantine permanently transformed Rome. What had once been a polytheistic state rooted in ancient traditions became a Christian empire. The old gods of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus still lingered, but their temples slowly emptied as Christianity spread. Constantine also made a bold political move that would shape history for centuries. Recognizing that Rome itself was no longer the most strategic location for governing such a vast empire, he established a new capital in the east, Byzantium, soon renamed Constantinople. Built on the Bosporus Strait, it was a city perfectly positioned between Europe and Asia, rich in trade routes and easy to defend. The decision to shift the empire's center of gravity eastward had long-term consequences. The Eastern Empire, with its wealth, strong defenses, and access to trade, would endure for 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The western half, meanwhile, was left increasingly vulnerable. Rome itself remained a symbolic heart, but the true power had moved elsewhere. At the same time, Constantine's policies sowed new tensions. By empowering the Christian Church, he gave it a central role in politics and culture. Bishops became influential power brokers, and disputes over theology often turned into heated political battles. Pagan traditions were pushed aside, alienating those who clung to the old ways. Religious unity was supposed to strengthen the empire, but instead it created divisions that would fester for generations. Economically, Constantine tried to stabilize the empire by introducing a new gold coin, the solidus, that became a cornerstone of Roman and later medieval currency. His reforms brought temporary stability, but they couldn't fully erase centuries of financial strain. The empire still struggled with high taxes, corruption, and the immense costs of defending its borders.
When Constantine died in 337 CE, the empire was still standing strong, but it was also changing in ways that made its future uncertain. His sons divided the empire among themselves, triggering yet another round of civil wars. And although Christianity was gaining dominance, it was far from unified, with fierce debates over doctrine threatening to tear the new faith and the empire itself apart. Constantine had given Rome a new identity and a new capital. But in doing so, he also accelerated the drift between East and West and placed enormous power in the hands of the Church. The empire looked revitalized, but beneath the surface, it was more fragile than ever. The fall of the West and Rome's legacy. After Constantine, the Roman Empire staggered through another century of struggle. The division between East and West grew sharper. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, remained wealthy and resilient. The Western Empire, however, was weaker. Poorer provinces, less trade, and borders constantly under siege. Barbarian groups, once kept at bay by Rome's legions, now pressed harder than ever. The Goths, Vandals, Huns, and others migrated into Roman lands, sometimes as refugees fleeing wars, sometimes as invaders. Rome increasingly relied on hiring these groups as mercenaries, but loyalty was thin when money and stability ran short. A critical blow came in 410 CE, when the Visigoths, under Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself. For centuries, Romans had believed their city eternal and untouchable. Now its walls had been breached. The shock reverberated across the world. Over the next decades, one crisis followed another. The Vandals swept into North Africa, cutting off vital grain supplies. The Huns under Attila terrorized much of Europe. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was more shadow than substance. Its emperors often puppets, its armies filled with foreign mercenaries, its treasury empty. In 476 CE, the end came quietly. A Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. There was no grand final battle, no fiery destruction, just the last Roman emperor in the West stepping down and the imperial title vanishing. But Rome's story didn't truly end. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, survived for nearly another 1,000 years. Roman law, engineering, language, and culture shaped Europe long after the empire's fall. Christianity, once persecuted, became the unifying faith of Europe. Even today, our roads, legal systems, architecture, and political ideas carry the imprint of Rome. The Roman Empire collapsed, but its shadow still stretches across the world.